I would assume they're trying to change course with the administration, but it seems like it could so spectacularly backfire, like with Nixon. If your boss is taken down, by extension, you would probably be taken down. What are they trying to accomplish with leaks?
Right. So you say from firsthand experience, I will say right here that I was not a leaker when I served in the administration. So
I suppose I would say you would know the process very well. I mean, of what would go through someone's head. Yeah.
And people are trying to do three things, I would say. Number one is advance their policy preferences at the expense of other policy preferences. So, for example, in the Gulf War, Colin Powell was constantly putting out in the press that he had objections to what they were doing in the Iraq War. Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense, complained that he sat in meetings with Powell every day, and Powell never issued a complaint about any way that the war was going. He only read about it in the press. So Powell was trying to advance its policy agenda through the press. The second thing is to advance oneself. Sometimes if you leak to the press, you will get better coverage from the reporters and columnists. The columnists Robert Novak and Roland Evans used to have these buttons. You're a source or you're a target, and if you're a source for them, they would treat you more nicely in their columns. And then the third is a target. You want to diminish somebody else. If there's somebody who's ahead of you in the pecking order, or somebody who's a rival of yours, or somebody who's causing trouble for you, you would often leak against them. One of the great examples of the Machiavellian leak was in the Nixon White House. Henry Kissinger was known for dating somewhat attractive famous ladies, including Jill St. John, who was a Bond girl. And he leaked to the press that he was dating St. John, but he told Nixon that William Rogers, his rival and the Secretary of State, had leaked it. This had two advantages for Kissinger. Number one was it let the press know he was dating a very attractive Bond girl, but the second was that it diminished his rival Rogers in the eyes of Nixon.
Yeah, I was curious about that when it comes to leaks. Who are people that stood a lot to gain, who did it well? And it sounds like Kissinger knew exactly how to do that. And then can you think of cases where it spectacularly blew up in their face and whatever the leaker was trying to accomplish had the opposite effect?
Well, I would say that the whole Valerie Plame incident in the Bush 43 administration, where Joe Wilson goes to is critical of the Iraq War in a New York Times op-ed, and then it is revealed via leak that Valerie Plame is a CIA agent and Wilson's spouse. And then there's an investigation inside the Bush administration of who leaked the name, because it's illegal to leak the name of a CIA undercover agent. She was not she was not a publicly named CIA agent. And we knew, or at least they knew internally, that Dick Armitage from State Department had been the one to leak the name, but it didn't stop the investigation from going forward. And people like Karl Rove were investigated, and someone like Scooter Libby was actually convicted for lying to investigators about the investigation into something that he had not done and something the investigators knew who had done it. So that really blew up in everybody's face. And Dick Armitage, who was the one who leaked it and knew that he was the one who leaked it even while the investigation was going, intentionally kept quiet about it, as I write in the book Fight House, because he didn't want his State Department to lose out in terms of faith in the debates with the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Vice President's office. So they intentionally let a colleague get into legal peril by keeping quiet because they didn't want to be disadvantaged in internal bureaucratic disputes.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
One other conflict you mentioned, and we haven't gotten up to Ronald Reagan yet, but you mentioned that there were contrasting management styles of Reagan and then First Lady Nancy Reagan, which led to staff clashes. How did she play into all of this? And I know First Ladies now have staffers, but what did the involvement in the affairs of the administration look like for her, and what was the source of this conflict?
Well, Nancy Reagan was very close to her husband, and obviously wives are always close to their husbands, but they had a particularly close relationship, and she was really, in some ways, his only friend. He had a lot of acquaintances, but he didn't have that many close friends. And she was constantly watching what was going on in the administration. The nickname for monitoring what Mrs. Reagan was up to was called the Mommy Watch, and Mike Deaver was assigned to being the one who was on the Mommy Watch. And she if she didn't like what someone was doing or how someone was doing it, she let them know. And in the second Reagan term, Don Regan was the chief of staff, and Nancy did not much like him. And she even said that he gets the chief part, but not the of staff part of the job. And they have a series of screaming matches over the phone. And in one of them, Regan hangs up on Nancy. And Jim Baker, who was Regan's predecessor as chief of staff, said, that's not just a firing offense, that's a hanging offense.
With Nancy, and we can explore her a little bit more, but we haven't looked at first wives. And who are some that are very active in the affairs of administration? Who are some that aren't as much? And do powers and staffing and other things of first wives grow over time, or does it just depend on the personality?
I think it grows over time, and now you're much more likely to have a first lady who's a professional woman as opposed to a Mamie Eisenhower type who was professionally, I guess, a housewife. So that has changed over time. Also, it's just more acceptable to have a first lady weighing in on things. I remember when Hillary Clinton was working on the healthcare plan, that was seen as very cutting edge and radical that the president let his wife lead an effort within the White House. I think it's less so now, but a couple of incidents that jump to mind are Betty Ford was quite outspoken in the Gerald Ford administration about issues, and sometimes not in line with what the administration's positions were. And in one instance, Ford's aide said to him, "Can you get Betty to stop saying this stuff?" And Ford bravely said, "Well, fellas, her office is down the hall. You go tell her." So it's really hard to control a first lady if she wants to go in a direction different than the administration.
And I guess a lot of this begs the question of, what do you make of a so-called peaceful White House versus one that's full of factions, full of cliques, full of leaks and everything? Is there any correlation between a good administration and a well-maintained staff, or is it the opposite? And what do you think the reasons for that are?
I would say that a good administration has a manageable level of conflict. I think if there's too little conflict, you have what we had in the Johnson administration, where you had groupthink and people only think what the president wants them to think, and sometimes that doesn't lead to the best policy results coming forward, and you're not able to beta test your ideas or challenge other people's approaches. However, if there's too much conflict, then you have dysfunction, and there's a lack of trust, and people can't speak openly in private meetings, and everybody's trying to get each other. So you need to find that manageable level of conflict. Of course, the word manageable is somewhat subjective, and it's hard to find the right spot, but you've got to find some place to be between groupthink and no conflict and all-out war where nobody can actually have a private conversation and think it'll stay out of the press.
Is there any administration that sticks out in your mind as the worst managed when it came to staff?
I think the Gerald Ford administration really jumps out at me. It was very problematic from minute one. I mentioned this guy, Bob Hartman, who was close to Ford and a problematic individual. He is his nickname in the White House is SOB, and he cheekily said that it stood for Sweet Old Bob, but it stood for something else, and he knew it too. And he is constantly at war with everybody, and he's very close to Ford, so Ford's reluctant to fire him. They are able to move him out of that anteroom outside the Oval Office to another office, but he stays for the entirety of the administration and is a problem throughout. So the Ford administration is really one that jumps out at me. And then Ford has, midway through his administration, what's known as the Halloween Massacre to try and get control over the fighting. He moves Kissinger out of his position as National Security Advisor, although Kissinger gets to stay at the State Department. He fires the CIA director. He fires the defense secretary. And he elevates Deputy Chief of Staff Dick Cheney to Chief of Staff. He elevates Don Rumsfeld from Chief of Staff to Pentagon, and he kicks Nelson Rockefeller off the ticket. And when I say the ticket, I mean for the 1976 vice presidential slot. Rockefeller was the sitting vice president, but Ford announced that he won't be on the ticket the next time. And it was just too much, and the American people didn't react well to it. And Ford even says that it was the biggest regret of his presidency that he did all that, and he felt like if he had to do it again, he would not have taken all those steps.
How was the Carter administration with all this?
Oh, the Carter administration was totally fun to write about because there was a lot of fighting. Carter intentionally did not have a chief of staff because he reacted poorly to so-called imperial presidency under Nixon, where H.R. Haldeman was a chief of staff with a lot of power. And then even under Ford, they didn't have a chief of staff, but they effectively did. They just called him a staff coordinator. And so Carter is determined not to have a chief of staff, but that means nobody's in charge. And on the first day, they're trying to figure out whether and how to have meetings, and they can't even decide that. And one of the older staffers says, well, I guess I'm the oldest here, I'll do it. But he wasn't the most respected staffer, so people kind of ignored him. Then Hamilton Jordan, who was young, but the chief strategist in the campaign, is asked, but he doesn't want to have management responsibilities. And he says, well, I guess we'll have a meeting when there's a reason to have a meeting. And another Carter aide looked at this and he said, if only the KGB could see us now, because they were just floundering about without a chief of staff and without a way to manage things. And Carter himself was a micromanager who famously micromanaged the use of the White House tennis court.
Right.
And one of his aides criticized his propensity to get into the details and said, the president is the highest paid assistant secretary of housing and urban development we've ever had, because he would get into the weeds on the writing of legislation, which is not really the president's job. So the Carter administration did have a lot of internal fighting, and it's one of the administrations that Obama was reacting to when he was trying to come up with his no drama Obama, because, as I said, previous Democratic administrations had been riven by conflict.
And moving into the 21st century, you note that there's a gender and age divide in the Obama administration. What did that look like?
So in the Obama administration, they had a number of set rules in the campaign. One was don't mess with the structure. Another was no a-holes. And all these rules were great inside the campaign. But once you actually get to the White House, some of these rules felt like they went by the wayside. And Dan Pfeiffer, who's the communications director on the campaign, expects to be communications director in the White House. And he was bypassed by a woman named Ellen Moran, who was not on the Obama campaign and it actually backed Hillary in the primaries. And Pfeiffer, who proudly talks of the rules during the campaign in his memoir, suddenly throws all those rules out the window and is emailing everybody and blistering this Ellen Moran woman left and right. And she actually did not survive very long as communications director, and one suspects that having a deputy who had it in for her probably did not help in that regard. So it's one of those things where it's nice to have rules in the campaign, but once you actually are governing, sometimes it's harder to keep them. And the senior staff women in the Obama White House, they got together, they had kind of a vulgar nickname for themselves, which I'm not going to repeat on air, and they had their own staff dinners. There was just women, no men. And they had this theory called amplification, where if a woman says something, another woman in the meeting was obligated to push forward that same idea and amplify it or acknowledge it and advance it. So the women were bound together to help each other, and I think sometimes to the detriment of men who sometimes reacted badly to it. And then the other thing is the age divide. You had a guy named Ben Rhodes in there who was the deputy national security advisor, who was very young. He was in his 20s when he joined the administration, and he kind of had a mind melt with Obama. But his foreign policy views were very different than the kind of traditional older Democratic views. He was much more critical of Israel. He was much more willing to cut bait on some of the Arab leaders in the Middle East during the Arab Spring of 2011. And he said that he knew he was getting criticism from some of the older people, but he knew that the younger people were on his side.
Well, that brings us to the Trump White House, and I think this is a big point of your book, that on the outside, for someone like me who's a casual observer, it looks like there's a revolving door and the staff is in chaos. But you argue that this is not without precedent. But it seems different. Is it because the rivalries are more publicly available, that if Trump doesn't have the favor of someone, then there's a nickname on Twitter that appears shortly after? So what's similar and what's different as far as you can see?
So one thing on the Trump administration I just have to start with, which is I don't know for sure. Nobody knows for sure what's going on inside there, and it's hard to know during an administration. If I had to write my Obama chapter during the Obama administration, I would have had access to much less material than I actually did in the end. And the Bush archives, Bush 43 archives, just came online in 2019 for their oral histories. And so by that theory, you're going to have to wait till 2031 or 2035, depending on what happens in the next election, to get all the inside scoop on the Trump administration. Now, obviously, you certainly read in the papers about fights within the White House, and does seem to be a lot of turnover. But we just don't know for sure what's going on. I argue in Fight House that it's clear that White House fighting is not unprecedented, and I show examples of fighting in every administration since Truman all the way through Obama. But we